Before Shortbus ever tries to explain itself, it slows things down. It creates room to breathe. The opening doesn't feel like a movie announcing its intentions. It feels like life happening without a script. Conversations drift. People talk, but not always about what they mean. Emotions sit just below the surface, unspoken but present. There's no urgency, no dramatic setup, no clear direction yet. And that quiet confidence is exactly what pulls you in. The film opens in a world that feels familiar to anyone who's ever lived inside their own head, a little too much. People are educated, self-aware and articulate, yet still disconnected from themselves in subtle ways. They know the words, they understand the concepts, but something isn't landing. Something isn't clicking. The intro doesn't call attention to this. It lets you feel it. That low-level tension between having freedom and not knowing what to do with it becomes the emotional undercurrent of the film. Set in New York City, Shortbus doesn't present the city as glamorous or chaotic. Instead, it feels lived in, like a place where people are surrounded by others but still feel isolated. The kind of city where you can have a full social life and still go home feeling unfinished. The opening moments reflect that energy, intimate without being intrusive, honest without being dramatic. You're not being asked to judge anyone, you're just being invited to observe. What's especially striking is how natural everything feels. There's no sense of performance. No one is trying to be shocking or profound. The characters speak the way real people speak, sometimes confidently, sometimes awkwardly, often circling around what actually matters. The film understands that real vulnerability doesn't arrive with big speeches. It shows up in hesitations, in unfinished thoughts, in the space between what people say and what they actually feel. The intro also understands something deeply human. That connection doesn't automatically mean intimacy. People can be open and still guarded, honest and still confused, comfortable and still lonely. Shortbus doesn't frame this as a problem to be solved. It presents it as a condition of being alive in a world where self-expression is encouraged, but self-understanding takes longer. There's a calm maturity to the way the film introduces its world. It doesn't chase attention. It doesn't rely on shock or spectacle. It trusts that the audience will recognize these emotional patterns because they've lived them. By the time the intro settles in, you realize the film isn't asking you to watch from a distance. It's asking you to sit with it, to stay present, to listen, and to let the discomfort exist without rushing to resolve it. That quiet invitation is what makes the opening so effective. It doesn't demand anything from you. It simply makes room and waits. What makes Shortbus feel so real isn't just what the characters say, but how they exist on screen. The cast is made up largely of first-time actors and non-traditional performers, and that choice shapes the entire emotional texture of the film. These don't feel like characters performing intimacy. They feel like people allowing the camera to witness it. At the center is Sofia, played by Soo-Kyun Lee, a relationship counselor who is deeply comfortable discussing other people's intimacy, but completely disconnected from her own. Her performance is subtle and restrained, built on quiet frustration rather than dramatic breakdowns. Sofia represents a familiar contradiction, someone who understands the theory but struggles with the practice. James and Jamie, played by Paul Dawson and PJ DuBois, bring a different energy. Their relationship appears stable on the surface, even joyful, but underneath it's defined by imbalance and unspoken need. James is intense, driven, always searching for something more, while Jamie is grounded, affectionate, and emotionally open. Together they reflect how even loving relationships can be shaped by mismatched desires. Then there's Severin, portrayed by Lindsay Beamish, whose confidence and sexual clarity contrast sharply with Sofia's uncertainty. Severin is direct, unapologetic, and emotionally present in a way that challenges the idea that freedom equals detachment. Rather than being framed as a symbol, Severin feels fully human, comfortable with themselves but still aware of complexity. Around them is an ensemble of characters who drift in and out of the story, each carrying their own quiet conflicts. None of them feel exaggerated. None feel reduced to labels. Together they create a sense of community built not on certainty, but on shared vulnerability. Shortbus unfolds quietly, without a traditional dramatic inciting incident. Instead, it eases into the lives of several people living in New York City, each navigating intimacy, identity, and emotional disconnection in their own way. The film doesn't announce where it's going. It lets the story reveal itself through everyday interactions, conversations, and moments that feel ordinary until their weight becomes clear. The story begins with Sofia, a relationship counselor who specializes in intimacy and communication. On the surface, her life appears stable. She's newly married, educated, and professionally confident. But beneath that stability is a growing sense of frustration she can't quite articulate. Despite her expertise, Sofia feels disconnected from her own emotional and physical experiences. She listens to others describe vulnerability for a living, yet struggles to access it herself. This internal conflict becomes the emotional starting point of the film. Running parallel to Sofia's story is the relationship between James and Jamie, a couple who appear deeply connected and affectionate. They share a life, a home, and a sense of mutual care. But as the story progresses, it becomes clear that their relationship isn't as balanced as it seems. James is restless and intense, constantly searching for something more, some deeper fulfillment or emotional breakthrough that he can't quite define. Jamie, by contrast, is warm, grounded, and emotionally available. He loves James deeply, but doesn't share the same urgency or dissatisfaction. This imbalance quietly shapes their dynamic, creating tension without open conflict. As these characters move through their daily routines, the film introduces Shortbus itself, an underground gathering space that functions as both a social hub and an emotional refuge. It's a place where people come together without expectations or formal structure. There's no hierarchy, no agenda, no requirement to explain yourself. For many of the characters, Shortbus becomes a space where honesty feels possible in ways it doesn't elsewhere. Sofia is gradually drawn into this environment. Initially as an observer, she listens, watches, and absorbs the energy of the people around her. Unlike her professional settings, where conversations are structured and goal-oriented, Shortbus offers openness without pressure. Over time, this exposure begins to challenge the emotional distance Sofia has normalized in her own life. She starts to question why she feels so disconnected despite understanding intimacy so well in theory. James, meanwhile, becomes increasingly consumed by his internal dissatisfaction. His search for fulfillment leads him to explore experiences outside the emotional comfort of his relationship with Jamie. This exploration isn't framed as betrayal, but as confusion. James isn't trying to hurt Jamie, he's trying to understand himself. However, his actions begin to strain their relationship, forcing both men to confront what they need and what they're willing to compromise. Jamie's role in the story is defined by patience and emotional openness. He loves James and wants to support him, but he also begins to realize that love doesn't always mean sacrificing your own needs. As James drifts further into his search, Jamie is left to decide how long he can wait for balance to return, or whether it ever will. Another important thread in the story follows Severin, a character who embodies a different approach to intimacy. Confident, direct, and emotionally present, Severin moves through the world with clarity that contrasts sharply with Sofia's uncertainty and James's restlessness. Severin's interactions with Sofia create a turning point in the narrative, not through dramatic confrontation, but through quiet honesty. These moments force Sofia to confront the gap between how she understands intimacy and how she experiences it. As the story progresses, the lives of these characters continue to intersect within the orbit of Shortbus. Conversations deepen, emotional boundaries shift, relationships are tested not by dramatic events, but by accumulated realizations. The film resists the urge to turn these moments into clear turning points. Instead, it allows change to happen gradually, through awareness rather than action. Sofia reaches a moment where avoidance is no longer sustainable. She's forced to confront the emotional distance she's maintained from herself and from others. This confrontation doesn't result in a sudden solution or transformation. Instead, it opens the door to vulnerability, messy, uncertain, and incomplete. James, too, reaches a point of reckoning. His pursuit of fulfillment forces him to recognize the cost of his restlessness. Jamie, no longer content to simply absorb the imbalance in their relationship, begins to assert his own needs. Their story doesn't resolve with clear answers, but with a renewed awareness of what it means to truly see each other. The final movement of the film brings the characters together in a shared moment that emphasizes presence over resolution. There's no grand conclusion, no declaration that everything is fixed. What changes is not the circumstances of their lives, but their willingness to remain open, to stay, to listen, and to accept uncertainty. Shortbus ends the way it begins, without explanation, without judgment, and without forcing closure. The plot doesn't offer solutions, it offers recognition. It suggests that connection isn't something you arrive at once and keep forever. It's something you negotiate, moment by moment, with honesty and risk. Upon its release in 2006, Shortbus immediately encountered resistance from censorship boards, distributors, and regulators across multiple countries. The controversy surrounding the film was not rooted in ambiguity or misunderstanding. It was direct, visible, and structural. Shortbus challenged long-standing boundaries around what mainstream cinema was allowed to show, and in doing so exposed how fragile and inconsistent those boundaries actually were. The primary reason for the film's banning or restriction in several regions stemmed from its unsimulated sexual content. Unlike most films that imply intimacy through editing, framing, or off-screen suggestion, Shortbus presented sex as an unfiltered part of its characters' lives. For many censorship authorities, this alone was enough to classify the film as pornographic, regardless of its narrative intent or artistic context. In countries where film regulation relies heavily on visual thresholds rather than thematic evaluation, Shortbus failed immediately. In the United States, the film avoided an outright ban but was confined to an NC-17 rating, a classification that has historically functioned as a commercial death sentence rather than a neutral content warning. The NC-17 label limited theatrical screenings, reduced advertising opportunities, and discouraged mainstream distribution. While technically legal, the rating ensured that the film would remain marginal, reinforcing the idea that adult audiences could not be trusted to engage with explicit material in a thoughtful way. Internationally, the response was often harsher. Several countries either banned the film entirely or required extensive cuts before approving release. These decisions were rarely accompanied by detailed explanations. Instead, they reflected a broader discomfort with narratives that normalized non-traditional relationships, queer intimacy, and emotional vulnerability alongside explicit sexuality. In many cases, the issue was not sex itself, but whose sex was being shown, and without moral framing or punishment. What made Shortbus particularly threatening to censorship bodies was that it refused to separate sexuality from emotional life. The film did not depict sex as deviant, tragic, or cautionary. There were no narrative consequences imposed for desire, no external judgment embedded in the story. This absence of moral correction conflicted directly with regulatory models that expect explicit content to justify itself through shame, danger, or downfall. Critics of the bans argued that the film was being evaluated through outdated standards that failed to account for context, authorship, and intent. Director John Cameron Mitchell consistently emphasized that Shortbus was not designed to provoke, but to reflect. The explicitness was not a gimmick, It was a refusal to sanitize experiences that are already present in real life but rarely acknowledged honestly in cinema. Over time, the controversy surrounding Shortbus became inseparable from its legacy. The bans did not silence the film, they amplified its cultural relevance. For many viewers, discovering Shortbus through limited screenings or underground distribution only reinforced its themes of hidden communities and restricted expression. Ultimately, the censorship of Shortbus revealed less about the film itself and more about the systems reacting to it. Systems uncomfortable with complexity, queerness, and intimacy that exists without apology. Shortbus does not end with answers, resolutions, or moral conclusions. Instead, it closes the way many real conversations do, unfinished, vulnerable, and still in motion. By the time the film reaches its final moments, it becomes clear that the journey was never about shock, controversy, or provocation. It was about permission. Permission to exist without explanation. Permission to feel without translating every emotion into something acceptable or marketable. What lingers after Shortbus isn't any single scene, but a mood, a sense of emotional openness that mainstream cinema rarely allows itself. The film refuses to wrap intimacy in irony or distance. It treats connection as something fragile and necessary, even when it's messy, awkward, or imperfect. That refusal is what gives the film its lasting power. It doesn't ask the audience to agree with every choice its characters make. It simply asks them to witness those choices without judgment. For many viewers, especially those navigating adulthood in an era defined by constant performance and self-curation, Shortbus feels quietly radical. It presents people who are searching for meaning not through success or validation, but through honesty. These characters are not chasing perfection. They are trying to be present with one another, to listen more than they speak, and to accept that desire and confusion often coexist. In a culture that tends to demand clarity and certainty, the film's comfort with ambiguity feels refreshing. The legacy of Shortbus rests in its insistence that intimacy is not a spectacle. It is not something that needs to be hidden, exaggerated, or explained away. By portraying emotional and physical closeness as part of everyday life, the film pushes back against the idea that vulnerability must be earned through suffering or redeemed through consequence. It allows softness to exist without punishment. Years after its release, Shortbus continues to matter, not because it broke rules, but because it questioned why those rules existed in the first place. It challenged the assumption that adults cannot handle explicit honesty, that tenderness must be coded, or that unconventional relationships need justification. In doing so, it carved out space for stories that prioritize emotional truth over comfort. As the film fades out, it leaves the audience with something rare, a sense of quiet recognition. Not everyone will see themselves reflected in Shortbus, but many will recognize the feeling of wanting to be understood without being simplified. That is where the film ultimately lands, not in controversy, but in connection. And long after the screen goes dark, Shortbus remains less like a statement and more like an invitation to speak honestly, to listen carefully, and to remember that intimacy in all its forms is still one of the most human experiences we have.